Okay, we're going to talk about the female reproductive system, and in this first part, we're going to talk about pelvic organs, and answer the what questions. What are the female reproductive pelvic organs, and what do they do, and what is the innervation blood supply of the pelvic organs? Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Morton, and I'm the noted anatomist. Okay, let's get started by getting an overview of what are the organs in the female reproductive system. We have ovaries, uterine tubes, uterus, and vagina. These are the ones that we're going to be focusing on. I know there are other organs in the female pelvis, such as the bladder and the rectum, but we're going to leave those for another topic. We're just focusing on those in the female reproductive system. So let's talk about ovaries first and talk about their topography, some supportive ligaments, its function, and vascular supply. So here in this, the ovaries are located in the pelvic cavity, and they're along the lateral wall within a structure called the broad ligament. So in this superior view of the pelvic cavity, we see the symphysis pubis anteriorly, and then right behind it is the bladder, and then behind that's the uterus, and behind that is the rectum. And in the lateral pelvic wall, there we have an ovary, and it's located within this structure called the broad ligament, which is really the bottom of the peritoneum. It's a mesothelial lining, and I'll talk about more about that in a few minutes. Now, the ovaries are supported by something called the ovarian ligament, and the ovarian ligament is in the medial region of each ovary and attaches to the lateral side of the uterus. So there's our ovary, there's the uterus, and then there is the ovarian ligament attaching or connecting the ovary to the uterus. Now, the ovarian ligament is really the superior portion of the embryonic gubernaculum. And I want you to hold that on pause for just a minute in your brain, because I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. So here we have a coronal section of the female reproductive system, pelvic organs, and there the ovaries are located, and they have a certain function. They are the primary sex organ. And ovaries produce female gametes. We know those as oocytes or the ovum. And the ovaries also produce the sex hormones estrogen and progesterone. And so how does that really function? So here we have a picture that shows the hypothalamus, part of the diencephalon, and then there's the anterior pituitary that's labeled. And then here we have the ovary, and there we have a blood vessel or capillary that's flowing by. And what happens then is the hypothalamus releases a gonadotropic releasing hormone, which then targets through the hypophyseal portal system gonadotrophs in the anterior pituitary that produce and secrete follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, follicle-stimulating hormone binds to specific receptors on the oocyte, and when that occurs, it causes proliferations of some of those oocytes, and also these oocytes produce, as a result, estrogen, which then target not only the oocyte, but also flow into the bloodstream and flow throughout the body. Then luteinizing hormone also binds in a high surge and causes ovulation, where the egg is then secreted into the peritoneal cavity and it flows throughout the uterine tube. The resultant corpus luteum, you see Cl in that yellow part there, then as a result of luteinizing hormone produces the hormone progesterone that flows throughout the blood and targets proliferation of the endometrium of the uterus. Okay, so now what is the vascular supply of the ovaries? So the ovaries are supplied by ovarian arteries and veins, and the ovarian arteries arise from the aortic, abdominal aorta. So here we have the abdominal aorta right there in that picture, and then there are our paired or bilateral ovarian arteries that course down, and then they go and they supply the ovaries. The key thing here is that these ovarian arteries are bilaterally symmetrical, the same on both sides. Now, what about the ovarian veins? Well, the ovarian veins have a different drainage. And so the right ovarian vein drains into the inferior vena cava, where the left ovarian vein drains into the left renal vein, which then drains into the inferior vena cava. So here we have the inferior vena cava, and there we have the right ovarian vein, and there we have the left ovarian vein, and there we have, the left renal vein, and there's the left ovarian vein. Now, watch what happens. Blood drains from the ovaries through those paired ovarian veins, but they're bilaterally asymmetrical because the right ovarian vein, as it ascends, drains into the IVC, and the left ovarian vein, as it ascends, drains into the left renal vein, which then drains into the IVC. Okay, so the vascular supply of the ovaries is the ovarian vessels, so we just talked about, as shown in this picture. Now, the ovarian vessels course in something called the suspensory ligament of the ovaries. And this is not the classic ligament as you think of, like, oh, a ligament is dense connective tissue that attaches bone to bone. So this suspensory ligament is a ligament in that it's connective tissue and it's connecting something. In this case, the suspensory ligament connects the ovaries to the aorta and IVC and such. And so the suspensory ligaments course within two layers of tissue in the broad ligament. There's one layer and there's another layer, and that's what's coursing in to go to the ovaries, so we call it the suspensory ligament. In this picture, this illustration shows them more anatomically accurate, where the ovarian vessels are shown there, and there's what they call the suspensory ligament, which is really just the peritoneum and connective tissue surrounding the ovarian vessels as they supply the ovaries. All right, and also that suspensory ligament is which they isolate, and then they ligate those ovarian vessels during oophorectomy, which means to cut out the ovaries, and this is to avoid severe bleeding. All right, so now we've just talked about the ovaries. Now let's go and talk about the uterine tubes and talk about the different names of the uterine tubes and the parts and the function. Okay, so the uterine tubes are right here, and the uterine tubes are called the uterine tubes because it's a tube that connects the uterus to the ovary, or just simply a tube off the uterus. Yeah, that makes sense. I like that name. But then some people said, well, it's all we call the oviduct because it's a duct that transports, there's an ovum, and it transports an ovum in this duct. So why don't we call it a duct that transports the ovum, an oviduct? Yeah, that's a good idea. Then an Italian anatomist says, I think you should name it after me because I identified this thing. And that was actually the very first name. And Gabriel Falloppio said, hey, I found this. Let's name it after me. So we called it the fallopian tube. And then another name, boy, how about a million names for the same structure, is salpinx, because that's Greek for trumpet-like instrument that was in ancient Greek that kind of looked like this. So they called it the salpinx. Now, salpinx never really stuck, but the derivative or etymology continues because we call the connective tissue part, or we call the part of the broad ligament that surrounds the tube the mesosalpinx for tube. And if you cut out the uterine tubes, we call that a salpingectomy, which means to cut out the trumpet-like structure. So there's all the names. But to tell you the truth, I'm probably just going to be using these two, uterine tube and oviduct. Those are the two terms that I'd be most familiar with. Now, the different parts of the uterine tube are as follows. There's a fimbriae, which are these like finger-like projections that surround the ovary. And then this dilated portion is called the infundibulum. And then we have the ampulla. And the ampulla of the uterine tube is the most likely location that a fertilization of an egg and a sperm occurs. It's going to occur here in the ampulla. And then we also have the isthmus, which is this part that's leading in to the uterus. There's the different parts of the uterine tube. And so we've just talked about the different names, its function, and parts of the uterine tube. Now let's talk about the uterus, parts and layers, its functions. We'll talk about the broad ligament and the round ligament of the uterus. So the uterus is a hollow organ in the pelvic cavity, and it's located between the bladder and the rectum. So here we have a sagittal section of the female pelvis, and there's the pubic symphysis, and there's the sacrum, front to back. And then there's our urinary bladder, and there's the rectum. And right in between the two, there's our uterus. And the yellow circle, or the yellow line, is outlining the uterus to show that it is flexed anteriorly. That's its classic location. But sometimes it can even be found in a flexed posteriorly position. In this view, which is showing this coronal section of the uterus, we're going to talk about its function. This is an organ of gestation, which means that's where a fertilized egg would then implant in the endometrium to develop. So the uterus receives and nourishes a fertilized oocyte until birth. And so the different layers, there's the endometrium, and this prefix endo means within. And metrium, whenever you see it, think uterus. Okay, the endometrium is epithelial lined, which is flourishes during the menstrual cycle. And that's where fertilized egg implants. Then the myometrium, myo for muscle, and the muscle layer is a irregularly arranged smooth muscle within the uterus. That's the power that helps contract during birth. and then the epimetrium, which is the outside. Epi means upon. Now, the different parts of the uterus is that this is the fundus, the dome-shaped part. This is the part that's palpated in trying to ballparking how far along pregnancy is. There's the isthmus, which is this narrowed portion of the bottom of the uterus, and the space in between is called the body. And then this part here, which is the neck of the uterus, and this is called the cervix. Think cervical vertebrae or the vertebrae in the neck. This is the cervix, the neck of the uterus. And so this opening that communicates the isthmus to the lumen of the uterus is called the internal os. And then the opening, the external os, communicates out into the vaginal canal. There's the different parts of the uterus. Now, what about the arterial supply to the uterus? Well, the uterine artery, which is a branch off the internal iliac artery, is the prime blood supply. And also there's some supply from the ovarian artery, which comes from the aorta. And so here we have the superior view of the pelvic cavity in a female, and there we have the bladder, and there's the uterus, and there's the rectum, okay? And there's our internal iliac artery, and we can see there, the one that was just highlighted, that's the uterine artery that comes to supply the uterus. Now look on the right, we see a descending ovarian artery that then branches and gives a branch off into the ovary, and then continues and gives a branch that goes all the way down to the uterus, okay? And just to show this again in this coronal section where there's our ovarian artery and there's a uterine artery, and so the ovarian's coming from the aorta, the uterine artery is coming from the internal iliac, and then here's the vaginal artery, which is also a branch off the internal iliac artery. Now watch right here. We see all this very rich anastomotic connection all along the uterine tube, the uterus, and proximal vagina. There is a strong amount of anastomoses where blood vessels connect to give dual supply. Okay, here's another supportive structure called the Cardinal ligament. It supports the cervix to the lateral walls of the pelvis, and it contains the uterine vessels. So what we're going to do is in the sagittal section, you see that dotted line? That's the level of this cross section. Okay, and so there's the bladder, there's the uterus, there's the rectum, and there's our uterine tubes, and there's the ovaries. Now, that's the extraperitoneal fat or fascia in yellow. And it's basically between, in this picture, in this level, it's between the transversalis fascia and the parietal peritoneum. And I show that because that plane of fascia, if we continue down, I forgot to say, and then there's the uterine vessels, which we're going to talk about. Now, that extraperitoneal fascia, if we continue down below the peritoneum in that same plane, is where we're going to see the cardinal ligament. So now watch in this upper right-hand corner as we then bring that level down. There's the level of the section right here. Okay, and you can see the uterine vessels that are highlighted. And there's the cardinal ligament. It's basically that extraperitoneal fascia, because now it's subperitoneal fascia because it's below the peritoneum, and it's a condensation and it contains the uterine vessels. And there it is in yellow highlighted. Okay, there's a cardinal ligament. It basically supports the bottom of the uterus and contains uterine vessels. Now there's the ureter, and you're going to notice the ureter is coursing inferior to the uterine vessels. So, so the cardinal ligament, it's a surgical relationship to talk about is that the ureter, which transports urine, courses under the uterine artery. So there's this water under the bridge way of remembering this, where here is water, there's the ureter, coursing under the bridge, which is the uterine artery. So watch, there's the ureter coursing under the uterine artery. And we talk about that surgical relationship because in doing a hysterectomy, when you're taking the uterus out, you clamp the blood supply, and part of clamping the blood supply is ensuring that you do not injure the ureter, because if the ureter is injured, scar tissue builds up, then you have a problem voiding urine from the kidney, and that can create a host of problems. So ureter is at risk of injury during ligation of the uterine vessels in a hysterectomy. So remember the relationship, water under the bridge. Now the round ligament of the uterus is it goes basically from the fundus of the uterus through the inguinal canal to the labia majora. And it's the inferior portion of this embryonic gubernaculum. So remember that again, because you said, hey, wait, I thought we already talked about something with the ovarian ligament. So hold that thought. I'm going to talk more about this round ligament of the uterus in a minute. But basically, I don't have a great picture to show other than there is the round ligament. It looks like it's cut, but it's just part of the picture. And at the top of the picture, it's where it's going through the inguinal ligament or inguinal canal. Now let's talk about this structure called the broad ligament. It's a part of the peritoneum. And it's a double fold of peritoneum that basically covers and connects the uterus, uterine tubes, and ovaries to the wall and floor of the pelvis. It has 3 subdivisions that we'll talk about. And there's an opening in it that the female has, but the male does not. So let's talk about each one of these. First, the broad ligament is a double fold of peritoneum that covers the anterior and posterior part of the uterus, the uterine tubes, and ovaries. So here's the sagittal section through the body, and in blue is the peritoneum, both the peritoneal lining and peritoneal fluid within the space. And so what we're going to do is zoom in a wee bit and see, there's the peritoneal cavity, and then there's our bladder, and there's the urethra, and there's the uterus, and there's the vagina, and there's the rectum, okay, to give ourselves oriented here. Now, that dotted box is what we're going to blow up and put here. And this is a lateral view of the uterus and peritoneal cavity, and they're separated from each other to make a point where there's the fundus of the uterus, and there's the peritoneum, and there's the peritoneal cavity. Now, I separated them for a purpose. Watch. Shing! And one more time. Shing! I did this because you can now see that when the uterus, which is in the subperitoneal space below the peritoneum, pushes its head up, it now is covered, watch, and an anterior layer and a posterior layer. And that's what we mean by a double fold of peritoneum that covers the anterior and posterior part of the uterus, uterine tubes, and ovaries. But all you see in this schematic is the uterus. And so we call that part of the blue line, the peritoneum, that's surrounding the uterus, uterine tubes, and ovaries, the broad ligament. And so here's a broad ligament in a posterior view, and there's the appropriate anatomy labeled. And there's the broad ligament, and it has an anterior and a posterior layer, a double fold. And then there's the mesometrium for a mesothelial lining, which is the type of tissue. And metrium, whenever you think metrium, you think, oh, that's right, uterus. So the mesothelium that lines the metrium, that lines the uterus. And then there's the mesosalpinx, the mesothelium that surrounds the salpinx, the trumpet, the tube. And so if we now take, and you see that yellow box surrounding, we're going to take that coronal section, go up here and take that, that's coronal, pardon me, sagittal section, and blow it up. We can take a look at now, study the 3 parts of the broad ligament: mesosalpinx, mesovarium, mesometrium. There's our uterine tube, there's our ovary, there's the uterus, and there's a few other structures to help give orientation. So now watch the broad ligament in blue. You can see the broad ligament surrounding in the sagittal section, okay, and also in the picture in the top right. And then there's the anterior layer and the posterior layer of the broad ligament. And then the part that, and there's, anterior and posterior layer in the picture in the top right as well. So there's the mesosalpinx, the double layer that surrounds the uterine tube, and the mesosalpinx in this other view. And then there is the mesovarium, the double membrane that surrounds the ovary. And there's a mesometrium, the double anterior and posterior layer of the uterus. Now, a summary, the broad ligament has 3 parts: mesosalpinx, mesovarium, and the largest one, mesometrium. So the broad ligament also has an opening, where the female peritoneum has an opening in the broad ligament, where there's no homologous opening in the male peritoneum. So here we have this picture where you can see the blue is the broad ligament, and then there is the opening. And this opening is less than 1 millimeter in diameter, so it's quite small. But there's a uterine tube, the ovary, and the uterus that are labeled. Now, there's the peritoneal cavity. Now, what do we mean by peritoneal cavity? We'll take a look at the sagittal section again, and that double arrow is showing you the same part of the peritoneal cavity in both pictures. Now, watch when we zoom in, okay? And so there's the egg, and then during ovulation, the egg pushes against the side of the ovary until finally in ovulation, the egg is ovulated into the peritoneal cavity, leaving the corpus luteum behind. And then that egg is going to flow around and hopefully get by the opening, this opening in the uterine tube, and then course into the uterine tube and then continue along its way to the uterus. You notice that it's dotted and it's a little lighter, showing that it's inside, as if you had X-ray vision. So let's recap. So what happens is the egg is ovulated from the ovary, shing, and that ovulation sends the egg through this thin lining of peritoneal into the peritoneal cavity. Some references talk about how there is no broad ligament around the ovary. Regardless if the reference says there is mesothelium over the ovary or not, the egg goes into the peritoneal cavity. That's key to this. And then the egg moves back into the uterine tube via opening in the broad ligament, and then it flows throughout the uterine tube. Now, let's do a little review of some of the things we've talked about so far using some embryology. So let's take a look at this little illustration that shows a female fetus at 8 weeks. And let's talk about a structure called the Gubernaculum, which gets its name because it's Greek for a pilot or steer. Like a steering committee is sometimes called a gubernatorial committee. This gubernaculum, this connective tissue, steers or basically aids in the descent and steering of the gonads in both males and females, but I'm focusing on females here. And it is only present and active during the formation of the urogenital system. But then when it happens in an adult female, it leaves two vestigial remnants, one called the ovarian ligament and one called the round ligament of the uterus. Okay? And so here we have the following. And here we have in this picture, there is showing the developing kidney and ureter in lime green. And then there's in orange, the developing paramesonephric duct. That's going to become the uterine tube and uterus. And then there in pink is the mesonephric duct, which is going to involute in females. And so on the other side, they're showing one of the primordial ovaries that are developing, the gonads developing in the female. And then there's an upper portion of the gubernaculum, and there's the lower portion of the gubernaculum. Now, the upper gubernaculum will become the ovarian ligament, and the lower gubernaculum will become the round ligament of the uterus. Now, watch what happens. Shing! And we go to 15 weeks. Shing! So what happens then is we can see the kidney and ureter develop in the more mature fetus, and there's the uterine tube and the uterus, and there's the inguinal canal, and there's the labia majora. Now watch, there's our ovary, and there's the upper part of the gubernaculum that is now connecting the ovary to the uterus. That is going to become the ovarian ligament. And then here, the lower part of the gubernaculum is attaching the uterus to the labia majora. And courses through the inguinal canal. That becomes the round ligament of the uterus. And so now in blue, you see that what I just highlighted, that is the peritoneum. Now it's cut. It's only showing part of the peritoneum, but you'll notice that the kidneys and ureters are behind that peritoneum. And as a result, we say, the kidneys and the ureters are behind the peritoneum. So we say they are retroperitoneal organs. Retro means behind. Now take a look at the ovaries, uterus, and uterine tubes. They're actually below the peritoneum. So we call those subperitoneal organs. And if we then take this dotted line and highlight the very bottom part of the peritoneum that's surrounding those organs, that's the broad ligament. Okay, that's what's surrounding those structures. So in an adult, there we have the kidney, ureter, and bladder. And there we have the uterus and the vagina. And there is our inguinal canal. And there's the labia majora. And so there's our ovarian ligament. There is the round ligament of the uterus. And there is the suspensory ligament of the ovary that's containing the ovarian vessels. So these both are derived from the gubernaculum, and some references even say the suspensory ligament as well. Okay, so there's the uterus and its parts. So now let's finish by talking about the vagina, its functions and parts. So the function of the vagina is as follows. It's a passageway for the endometrium during menstruation. That's how the menses gets from the uterine cavity through the external os of the cervix into the vaginal canal and out of the body. The vagina also serves as a receptacle for the penis during sexual intercourse. And it also serves as the birth canal. So some of the parts of the vagina are as follows. There's a uterine cavity for orientation. There's the cervix, and there's the vaginal canal. Then you're going to see highlighted right there the internal lining of the vaginal canal. And notice these irregular folds or ridges are called vaginal rugae that help increase the size of the vaginal canal. And then these recesses are called the lateral fornices, or the lateral fornix. And if we now take a look at the sagittal section of the female pelvis, and we can see here the uterine cavity, and there's our cervix, and there's our vaginal canal, and we highlight that vaginal canal again, there are those vaginal rugae that help increase for changing the diameter of the vaginal canal. And there's an anterior fornix and a posterior fornix. So those two different fornices. So if we then take a look at a different view there, as if a speculum view of the cervix through the vaginal canal looks like this, where there's the external os of the cervix, and then there we have an anterior and posterior fornix, and there are the two lateral fornices is what it'll look like as if looking through speculum. So there's the external os and some of the fornices that you can see there. And so let's now take this female reproductive system pelvic organs in a nutshell. We have the ovaries that are located in the lateral pelvic wall, and they're supported by suspensory and ovarian ligaments. They function by producing an ovum and estrogen and progesterone, and they're supplied by ovarian vessels. The uterine tubes, also called fallopian tubes or oviduct or salpinx, help to transport the ovum from the ovary to the uterus, and it has the fimbriae all the way down to the isthmus. Then we have the uterus, which has a fundus, isthmus, body, and cervix, and it then also helps to receive a fertilized egg to implant in the endometrium to develop and nourish it throughout its course, and the smooth muscle of the myometrium to help with delivering the baby. The broad ligament, the bottom of the peritoneum that surrounds these structures, and the round ligament, which is a derivative of the gubernaculum that helps support it. And then the vagina, which helps serve as a receptacle for the penis during intercourse and a passageway for menses and a baby. And that, my friends, is the female reproductive system and pelvic organs in a nutshell. Sunny sky sleeps in the morning. He doesn't know when to rise. Closes his weary eyes upon the day. Look at him yawning, blowing his morning hours away. He knows how to ease down slowly. Everything is fine in the end, and you will be pleased to know the sunny skies hasn't a friend.